Today, we are traveling way back in time. Not to ancient Rome or Greece, but to a totally vibrant classical world that was flourishing in the deep south of India. We're diving into the Sangam Age, this incredible period from about the 3rd century BC all the way to the 3rd century AD. This was a time of powerful kings, huge international trade, and honestly, some of the most beautiful poetry ever written. But since this all went down 2,000 years ago, the real question is, well, it's a bit more basic.
Right? How do we actually know any of this stuff? It's not like they left behind a library of history books, and they definitely didn't have video diaries. The story of the Sangam Age is really a masterpiece of historical detective work. It's pieced together from all these little fragments of the past. It's a full-blown investigation.
So that's what we're going to do. We're going to become historical detectives for this explainer. Together, we're going to follow the trail of clues. I'm talking everything from ancient tombs and Roman gold coins to little scratches on pottery and epic poems that have somehow survived for centuries. And we're going to try to reconstruct this incredible lost world. Okay, let's get into it. So first up, the evidence locker. Before we can even begin to talk about the kings, the culture, the poetry, we have to understand what historians are even working with. What are the actual, tangible things that prove the Sangam Age even existed in the first place? Well, it turns out the toolkit is super diverse. First, you've got archaeological finds, the stuff they literally dig out of the ground. Then there's numismatics, which is the fancy word for studying coins. And these coins are like tiny little metal messengers from the past. You've got epigraphy, the study of inscriptions carved into stone or pottery. And finally, of course, the written word. This is huge. It includes the amazing literature from the period itself and, what's really cool, accounts from outsiders, Greeks and Romans, who are writing about the business they were doing there. Now check this out, because this tells us so much about how they thought about life and death. Archaeologists find these things called megalithic burials. Sometimes they used cist burial, which is kind of like a stone box built underground. But a really unique practice in the South was urn burial. After cremation, the ashes were put into a massive pottery urn and then buried. Now, this isn't just some random detail. This difference in ritual is a massive clue. It points to a society with deep, diverse beliefs about the afterlife, with traditions that probably varied from one community to the next. It's like a silent conversation about life and death, spoken through earth and stone. This right here is one of my favorite pieces of evidence, because it's a total outsider's perspective. This quote is from a text called The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. You can basically think of it as a sailor's guide to the Indian Ocean, written back in the 1st century AD. The author, some anonymous Greek-speaking merchant, is talking about the ports of South India. So this isn't some myth or legend, it's a practical business manual. And it tells us, flat out, that this region was an economic powerhouse, a place where huge Roman ships were sailing to, specifically to load up on tons and tons of spices.
And if that quote wasn't enough proof for you, get this. We are not talking about a couple of coins that some tourists might have dropped. We're talking about thousands, literally thousands of Roman coins, gold, silver, and copper, found in buried hoards all across the region. So what does that tell us? This wasn't a little trickle of trade. It was a flood. It was a massive, long-term economic relationship where South Indian goods were so valuable that a river of Roman money flowed in to pay for them. Okay, so we've got our clues. The burials, the foreign accounts, the coins. Now let's start using them to build a picture of what life was actually like. How did these people live? How was their society organized? And how on earth did they build an economy so powerful it could attract the Roman Empire from halfway across the world? Okay, now this concept is absolutely key to understanding Sangam society, and it's probably pretty different from what you might expect. It's called Thanai. For a while, it seems like instead of organizing their society mainly by caste or by birth, they often defined who you were by the very land you lived on. It's incredible. So if you lived in the Kurinji, the hills, your job was hunting. If you were in the Marutham, the fertile river plains, you were a farmer. Down on the Nathal, the coast, you were a fisherman. Even the Palai, the dry, arid lands, had its own designated occupation, raiding and robbery. It just shows how their entire culture, their gods, their poems, their jobs, was completely woven into the land they lived on. And it was from these 5 different landscapes that this truly global economy exploded. Each of these Thanais produced something valuable, and when you put it all together, you had a catalog of luxury goods that the rest of the ancient world was desperate to get its hands on. Their products were sailing off to Egypt, to Arabia, and right into the heart of the Roman Empire. And what exactly were they selling? Just look at this list. We're talking about the absolute bestsellers of the ancient world. Ivory, pearls, precious gems, and of course, the king of all spices, pepper. But the last point on this slide is what really blows my mind. One of the great Sangam epics, the Manamagalai, actually describes this super diverse, multicultural workforce. It mentions artisans from Magadha, way up north, Maratha mechanics, and even Yavana, that's their word for Greeks or Romans, carpenters, all working side by side with local Tamil craftsmen. This place wasn't just a stop on a trade route. It was a cosmopolitan melting pot, a true global hub 2,000 years ago. So how was a society this complex and rich even governed? Well, it wasn't one single empire. Power was spread out across 3 different levels. At the very local level, you had the Kijar, who were basically the village heads. Then you had the Valir. These guys were powerful chieftains who controlled the hills and forests, those resource-rich Kurinji and Mulai zones. And then, at the very top, controlling the best farmland and the biggest ports, were the Vendar, the 3 great crowned kings.
And it's these Vendarapuchar, these 3 great kings, who really dominate the political story of the Sangam Age. Together, they were known as the Movindar. They were the big players, controlling the 3 major regions of the Tamil country. And they were constantly fighting with each other, and with those Valir chieftains, for power, for fame, and for control of all that juicy trade. So let's meet them.
This slide gives us a perfect bird's-eye view of the whole political scene. So over on the west coast, in modern-day Kerala, you had the Cheras. Their capital was Vanji, their symbol was the bow and arrow. Then, in the super-fertile Kaveri River Delta, you had the Cholas, ruling from Urayur, with the tiger as their emblem. And way down in the far south, you had the Pandyas, who were famous for their pearl fisheries. They ruled from the legendary city of Madurai, and their symbol was the fish. These 3 dynasties are the main characters of Sangam history.
Let's start with the Cholas. Their most celebrated king was a guy named Karikala. He was a military genius who supposedly defeated a massive army made up of both the Pandyas and the Cheras. But he wasn't just a conqueror, he was a builder. He's the one credited with constructing the Kalanai, or the Grand Aniket, an incredible dam across the Kaveri River. Get this, it's one of the oldest water diversion structures in the entire world that is still in use today. That's a legacy of both military power and amazing engineering.
All right, let's head west to the Cheras, the masters of the coast. Their greatest king, at least according to the poets, was Sengu Tuvan, known as the Red Chera. His power was on the sea. He was famous for crushing pirates who were threatening the vital port of Musiri. But he's also remembered for his cultural influence. He introduced something called the Patani cult, which was the worship of the goddess Kanagi as the perfect ideal wife. This is a great example of how these kings weren't just warlords worried about money. They were actively shaping the culture and beliefs of their people.
And finally, we head to the deep south, to the land of the Pandyas. The Greek historian Megasthenes mentioned them centuries earlier, noting that their kingdom was famous for its pearls. Their legendary ruler was Nirunjayan, and just like Karikala, he is celebrated for winning a massive battle, this time against a huge alliance of his rivals. These stories of epic battles tell you just how constant and intense the fight for control really was among the Movindar.
But this age of the 3 crowned kings, this incredible period of trade and conflict, it couldn't last forever. The dynasties started to weaken, new powers rose up, and the era eventually came to a close. But what they left behind was maybe more powerful than any kingdom, a cultural and literary legacy that would shape South Indian identity for thousands of years.
Before we get to the poetry that survived, I want to share this one cultural detail that gives you a really stark, profound look into the mindset of these rulers. It's a practice called Vada Kudutol. This was a ritual where a king who was defeated in battle would choose to commit suicide by fasting to death. To them, honor was literally more important than life itself. This was a warrior's code that went right to the very top of their society.
Okay, let's talk about the literature, because this is where the Sangam world really comes to life. And what is so amazing is that this was not just a boys' club. We know of over 30 women poets from this period. They composed more than 150 poems that have survived to this day. Just stop and think about that for a second. This wasn't a society where literature was only being made by men in royal courts. This completely changes our picture of the era, revealing a time when female voices were a vital and respected part of the conversation.
And the sheer amount of literature they created is just staggering. We have the Tolkappiyam, which is the earliest Tamil grammar book, but it's also an incredible guide to their society. We have the Ettuthogai and the Pattuppattu, which together contain almost 2,400 poems. We have the Tirukural, a masterpiece on ethics and morality that people still quote all the time today. And then we have the 2 great epics, Silapadikaram and Manimekalai, these sweeping stories of love, loss, and adventure. This literature, this is their true, lasting legacy.
So, what happened? Around the 3rd century AD, the power of the Movendar just faded. A new, mysterious power called the Kalabras swept in and took over. And here's the crucial detail. The Kalabras supported Buddhism and Jainism. So the later Hindu dynasties that eventually defeated them, and whose history books survived, had every reason to paint their rule in a bad light, calling it a dark age where culture and society supposedly fell apart.
And this brings us right to our final and most critical thought. This whole idea of a dark age is now being seriously questioned by historians. Because those amazing epics we just mentioned, Silappatikaram and Manimekalai, they were probably written during this so-called dark age. So it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How we remember the past is shaped entirely by the stories that happen to survive. And that leaves us with the big question. How much of what we call history is what actually happened? And how much of it is just the version of the story that was told by the winners?